Picture this: a royal bloodline so ancient, so shrouded in myth, that even the whispers of their existence sound like echoes from another world. The Merovingians weren't just Europe's first royal dynasty. They were the stuff of legends, rulers who walked the line between history and mystery. Their story begins in the shadowy aftermath of Rome's fall, when chaos gripped the continent, and from that chaos rose a family whose name would be whispered for centuries, not just in chronicles, but in secrets, conspiracies, and tales of divine destiny. What made them so powerful, and why did their reign, which once seemed unshakable, vanish almost overnight? Their origins alone sound like something torn from a medieval epic. Some claim the Merovingians were descended from a mythical sea creature, a quinator, while others wove even grander threads into their lineage, ties to Jesus Christ himself and the elusive Holy Grail. These weren't just kings, they were figures tangled in sacred lore, their very bloodline said to carry a supernatural weight. But here's where history twists into something even more fascinating. For all their legendary beginnings, their end was startlingly abrupt. One moment, they stood as the unchallenged rulers of Francia, their influence stretching across Europe. The next, they were pushed aside, their power stripped by their own trusted advisors in a move that reshaped the continent forever. So what really happened? How does a dynasty so mighty, so steeped in mystique, simply fade from the throne? That's the heart of this journey, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and the shadows where history and legend blur. We'll trace their rise from warlords to kings, explore the whispers of their sacred connections, and unravel the shocking plot that brought them down. This isn't just a story of crowns and conquests. It's a puzzle that's fascinated scholars and treasure hunters alike, a mystery wrapped in the enigma of Europe's darkest age. And by the end, you'll see why the Merovingians weren't just forgotten rulers. They were the spark that lit legends, conspiracies, and quests that still echo today. Ready to step into the labyrinth? Let's begin. The story of the Merovingians begins not with a coronation, but with a whisper, a legend so strange it defies belief. At the heart of it stands Merovech, the semi-mythical founder whose name would define an entire dynasty. Some chroniclers claimed he was the son of two fathers, a Frankish king and a mysterious sea creature known as the quinator. Imagine that, a ruler born of both human blood and primordial myth, his very existence blurring the line between history and fable. This wasn't just royal propaganda. It was a deliberate weaving of the supernatural into the fabric of power, a way to elevate the Merovingians above mere mortal kings. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire's collapse had left a vacuum, and the Franks, a patchwork of Germanic tribes, seized the moment. The Merovingians didn't just emerge as warlords, they mastered the art of alliance. They married into Roman aristocratic families, absorbed Roman legal traditions, and even adopted Christianity strategically, positioning themselves as heirs to both Germanic warrior culture and Roman imperial prestige. It was a brilliant balancing act. While other tribes fractured, the Merovingians united the Franks under a single banner, their authority bolstered by an aura of divine favor. Their rise was as much about diplomacy as it was about the sword. Clovis, Merovech's grandson, became the dynasty's first true king, baptized with the blessing of the church, a move that secured the loyalty of Rome's fading Christian elite. But here's the twist: the Merovingians never fully abandoned their pagan roots. They ruled with one foot in the old world of sacred groves and blood oaths, and the other in the new order of cathedrals and bishops. This duality made them formidable. To their subjects, they weren't just rulers, they were living bridges between worlds, chosen by forces both earthly and otherworldly. And yet, for all their mythical origins, their power was ruthlessly practical. They rewarded loyal warriors with land, forged marriages to secure borders, and played rival factions against each other with cold precision. The Merovingians didn't just inherit a broken empire, they rebuilt it in their image, blending Frankish ferocity with Roman sophistication. By the time they reached their peak, their kingdom stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, a realm forged as much by legend as by steel. But as we'll soon see, even the most carefully crafted myths can't shield a dynasty from the ambitions of those who serve it. Clovis I wasn't just a king, he was the architect of a legacy. When he took the throne in the late 5th century, the Franks were a collection of fractured tribes, each with their own warlords and rivalries, but Clovis had a vision. Through a mix of battlefield brilliance and ruthless political maneuvering, he began stitching these factions together, one conquest at a time. His first major victory came against the Roman ruler Syagrius, a battle that wasn't just about territory, it was a declaration that the old order had fallen and a new power was rising from its ashes. What set Clovis apart wasn't just his skill with a sword, but his instinct for symbolism. His conversion to Christianity in 496 wasn't merely a personal spiritual choice, it was a masterstroke of statecraft. By aligning himself with the church, he gained the backing of Rome's fading but still influential Christian elite, while also distancing himself from the pagan warlords who still clung to the old gods. The story goes that during a desperate battle against the Alemanni, Clovis vowed to convert if the Christian God granted him victory. When his enemies fled the field, he kept his word, and with his baptism in Rheims, the Merovingians became the first Germanic dynasty to embrace the cross. Yet Clovis was no saint. He wielded faith as deftly as he did his axe. After securing church support, he turned on rival Frankish kings, even those who were his own relatives. One by one, he eliminated them, sometimes through battle, other times through treachery. His rise was a tapestry of alliances made and broken, of oaths sworn and blood spilled. And at the center of it all was Paris, the city he chose as his capital, not just for its strategic location, but as a statement. This was where Roman roads met Frankish lands, where the past and future intertwined. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis had transformed a patchwork of tribes into a unified kingdom stretching from modern-day France deep into Germany. He left behind a legal code, the Lex Salica, that blended Frankish customs with Roman law, and a royal lineage that would dominate Europe for centuries. But his greatest legacy was the template he created, a ruler who could be both a pagan warlord and a Christian king, a man of faith and a butcher of rivals. The Merovingians would build on this duality, but none would ever match the raw, calculating genius of their founder. And as we'll see, that very brilliance sowed the seeds of their eventual downfall, because empires built on charisma rarely outlive their creators. The Merovingian Golden Age wasn't just a period of power, it was a spectacle. By the 6th and 7th centuries, their kingdom had become the beating heart of Europe, a realm where lavish courts glittered with gold and intrigue, where queens wielded influence as deftly as kings, and where the fusion of Frankish tradition and Roman prestige created a culture that dazzled the continent. Imagine halls draped in silk, where poets recited verses in Latin while warriors drank from jeweled cups, a world where the legacy of Rome met the raw vitality of the Germanic tribes. At the center of this grandeur stood figures like Brunhilda, a queen whose story reads like a saga. Born a Visigothic princess, she married into the Merovingian Dynasty and became one of the most formidable women of her age. Brunhilda wasn't content to sit quietly in the shadows. She ruled as regent for her sons and grandsons, rebuilt roads and fortresses, and even clashed with the church to protect royal authority. Her political savvy was matched only by her ruthlessness when her rival Queen Fredegund ordered the assassination of Brunhilda's sister. It ignited a feud that would span decades, a bloody tapestry of revenge and ambition. Yet for all the drama, Brunhilda's reign symbolized something profound. The Merovingian court was a place where women could shape the fate of empires. Their territories stretched from the Loire Valley to the edges of Bavaria, a patchwork of lands held together by a delicate balance of loyalty and force. The Merovingians didn't just conquer, they absorbed. They let local customs flourish while imposing a unifying royal presence, through coinage stamped with their likeness, through laws that blended Frankish and Roman traditions, and through the sheer spectacle of their courts. When a Merovingian king traveled, it was an event. His entourage included not just warriors but bishops, scholars, and artisans, a mobile capital that showcased the dynasty's sophistication. Religion was another pillar of their power. Monasteries dotted the landscape, their scriptoria preserving not just Christian texts but the administrative records of the kingdom. The Merovingians patronized saints and relics, turning faith into a tool of statecraft. A king might donate land to a monastery, securing both divine favor and the loyalty of its abbot. This wasn't just piety, it was politics wrapped in sacred ritual. Yet for all their brilliance, the seeds of decline were already taking root. The very grandeur of their courts masked a growing weakness and over-reliance on regional strongmen, the mayors of the palace, who would eventually overshadow the kings themselves. The Merovingian Golden Age was a shimmering mirage, a zenith so dazzling that few noticed the cracks beneath the gilded surface. And as we'll see, the fall would be as dramatic as the rise. At the heart of Merovingian mystique lies a claim so audacious it borders on heresy, the idea that their bloodline traces back to Jesus Christ himself. This wasn't some medieval rumor whispered in cloisters. It exploded into modern consciousness through books like The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which wove history, conjecture, and conspiracy into a tantalizing narrative. According to these theories, Christ didn't die on the cross but fled to Gaul with Mary Magdalene, founding a sacred lineage that eventually became the Merovingians. It's a story that blends biblical revisionism with royal intrigue, suggesting these kings weren't just rulers but divine heirs, their very existence a secret guarded by shadowy societies like the Priory of Sion. The Priory of Sion, allegedly a centuries-old secret order, claimed to protect this explosive truth. Documents surfaced in the 20th century, meticulously forged, as later investigations revealed purporting to show a direct link between the Merovingians and Christ's descendants. These papers listed Grand Masters like Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton as members, implying that Europe's greatest minds had secretly nurtured this knowledge. The hoax was elaborate, but its impact was real. It tapped into a deep human craving for hidden histories, for the idea that power and spirituality are entwined in ways official records dare not acknowledge. Historians dismiss the Christ connection as pure fabrication, pointing out that the earliest Merovingian chronicles never mention it. But here's the twist: the myth persists because it speaks to something primal. The Merovingians themselves cultivated an aura of supernatural legitimacy, from their quinator origins to their rumored healing powers. Kings like Dagobert II were said to possess sacred knowledge, their very touch capable of miracles. When modern conspiracy theorists resurrected these ideas, they weren't inventing from scratch. They were amplifying whispers that had lingered for centuries. What makes this more than just a wild theory is how it reshapes our view of history's winners and losers. If the Merovingians were divine heirs, their overthrow by the Carolingians becomes not just a political coup but a cosmic crime, a silencing of sacred truth. This narrative paints the Church as complicit, accusing it of erasing Christ's true lineage to maintain doctrinal control. It's a seductive story, one that turns dusty genealogy into a thriller, where every monastery manuscript might hold a coded revelation. Yet beneath the conspiracy lies a simpler, darker truth. Power thrives on mystery. Whether in the 6th century or the 21st, rulers and rebels alike spin myths to justify their authority. The Merovingians understood this, weaving their own legends to awe their subjects. Modern mythmakers simply gave those legends new life, proving that the line between history and fantasy is as thin as a parchment page and just as easily forged. By the 7th century, something strange was happening to the Merovingian kings. They were fading into their own thrones. Later chroniclers wouldn't call them rulers. They'd sneer at them as the do-nothing kings, figureheads who reigned but didn't rule. Imagine a royal court where the man wearing the crown was little more than a prop. His long hair, the sacred symbol of Merovingian legitimacy, kept meticulously groomed while real power pooled in the hands of his advisors. The kings still sat in their halls, still issued decrees, but the strings were being pulled by a new class of power brokers, the mayors of the palace. This shift didn't happen overnight. It began with the dynasty's own success. Earlier Merovingians like Clovis had been warrior kings, leading armies and crushing rivals personally. But as the kingdom grew, so did its bureaucracy. Someone had to manage the estates, collect taxes, and negotiate with regional lords tasks that demanded administrative skill, not just battlefield bravery. Enter the mayors of the palace, initially royal stewards who handled the day-to-day governance. Over time, these officials amassed land, wealth, and private armies of their own. The kings, raised in luxury and increasingly detached from the gritty realities of rule, became dependent on them. The Carolingian family, mayors of the palace in Austrasia, epitomized this quiet coup. Charles Martel, the Hammer, didn't just advise his Merovingian king, he commanded the armies that turned back the Umayyad invasion at Tours in 732, a victory that saved Christian Europe. When a mayor wins battles while the king stays home, who do the warriors pledge loyalty to? The answer was obvious. By the time Martel's grandson, Pepin the Short, sought the crown itself, the Merovingians were already ghosts in their own kingdom. But calling them do-nothing kings oversimplifies a darker truth. Some were likely sidelined by design. A child king, weak or disinterested, was easier to control than a strong-willed monarch. One chronicle describes the later Merovingians being carted around in ox-drawn wagons like sacred relics, trotted out for ceremonies while the mayors governed. This wasn't just laziness, it was systemic decay, the slow draining of authority from a dynasty that had once blended myth and might. The Carolingians didn't steal power. The Merovingians let it slip through their fingers, one disengaged generation at a time. Yet even in their decline, the kings held one card, their bloodline's sacred aura. The Carolingians couldn't just overthrow them, they needed the church's blessing to make it legitimate. So in 751, Pepin sent the last Merovingian, Childeric III, to a monastery, not a dagger in the dark but a velvet-gloved coupe. The Pope anointed Pepin as the new king, not because of divine right, but because he could do what the Merovingians no longer did, rule. And with that, Europe's first royal dynasty faded into the shadows, their legacy reduced to whispers in monastic chronicles, and centuries later, the fuel for conspiracy theories that would outlast even their bones. Brunhilda wasn't just a queen, she was a force of nature in a world that tried relentlessly to break her. Born a Visigothic princess in the mid-6th century, she was thrust into Merovingian politics as a teenage bride, married to King Sigebert of Austrasia to seal an alliance. But Brunhilda refused to be a pawn. When her sister, married to Sigebert's rival King Chilperic of Neustria, was murdered, strangled on the orders of Chilperic's vengeful concubine Fredegund, Brunhilda's life became a relentless pursuit of power and retribution. This wasn't just a feud, it was a generational bloodbath that would split the Frankish kingdom for decades. Her political genius lay in her ability to manipulate the fragile Merovingian system. While kings ruled, real power often flowed through the women who controlled access to them through marriages, alliances, and the rearing of heirs. Brunhilda mastered this shadow game. After Sigebert's assassination, likely orchestrated by Fredegund, she became regent for her young son, then her grandsons, ruling Austrasia with an iron grip. She reformed taxes, rebuilt crumbling Roman roads, and even clashed with bishops who dared challenge her authority. But her most potent weapon was marriage politics. She married her daughter to the Visigothic king in Spain, her granddaughter to the Lombard ruler in Italy, weaving a web of alliances that stretched across Europe. Yet every move bred enemies. The feud with Fredegund's Neustrian faction escalated into open war, with battles so brutal chroniclers described rivers choked with corpses. Brunhilda survived multiple coups, once escaping execution by charming her captors with her wit and royal bearing, but her ruthlessness became her undoing. In her 80s, accused of ordering the deaths of 10 kings, some her own relatives, she was captured by Fredegund's son, King Clothar II. The execution he devised was a spectacle of cruelty, dragged by a wild horse, then torn limb from limb, her body burned to erase even the memory of her reign. Legacy, though, is harder to destroy. Brunhilda's downfall wasn't just personal, it marked the end of an era when Merovingian women could wield power openly. Later chroniclers painted her as a Jezebel, a warning against female ambition. But dig deeper and you'll find a ruler who rebuilt infrastructure, patronized the arts, and held a fracturing kingdom together longer than anyone thought possible. Her life exposes the paradox of Merovingian power, how a dynasty that revered sacred bloodlines could be so savagely torn apart by them. And in the end, her story isn't just about one queen's vengeance, it's about the price of holding onto power in an age where every throne was built on sand. Dagobert I strode onto the stage of Merovingian history like a man determined to reverse time itself. Crowned in 629, he inherited a kingdom fraying at the edges, regional nobles grabbing power, church leaders chafing against royal authority, and the treasury drained by generations of infighting. But Dagobert refused to play the role of a fading monarch. Instead, he launched a reign that momentarily halted the dynasty's slide into irrelevance, proving that even in twilight, the Merovingians could still burn bright. His first task was restoring royal prestige, and he did it with sheer theatrical brilliance. Unlike his predecessors who delegated governance to mayors, Dagobert ruled personally, holding court in Paris with a splendor unseen since Clovis's day. Chroniclers described his palace as a whirlwind of activity, judges dispensing verdicts, ambassadors bearing gifts from as far as Constantinople, and artisans crafting gold-leafed reliquaries under the king's direct patronage. This wasn't just administration, it was performance, a deliberate spectacle to remind the Franks what a true Merovingian king looked like. Then came his masterstroke, Saint Denis. The abbey outside Paris housed the tomb of France's legendary first bishop, and Dagobert poured riches into transforming it into a spiritual powerhouse. He gifted lands, funded lavish processions, and even commissioned a golden throne for the saint's relics, a throne he'd later be buried before, binding his legacy to the martyr forever. In elevating Denis, Dagobert wasn't just buying divine favor, he was crafting a new narrative. The saint became the dynasty's celestial protector, a symbol that God still smiled on the Merovingian bloodline. But Dagobert's true genius lay in balancing old and new. He upheld Frankish tribal laws while streamlining justice, appointing roving magistrates to curb corrupt local lords. He minted coins stamped with his profile, ensuring even peasants knew their king's face. And when the church grumbled about his 3 marriages, a scandal by Christian standards, he shrewdly donated more land to monasteries, trading earthly indulgences for heavenly silence. Yet for all his brilliance, Dagobert's reign exposed the dynasty's fatal flaw. However strong the king, the system around him was rotting. His death in 639 plunged Francia back into chaos, with child heirs and warring regents squandering his gains. Later chroniclers would mythologize him as the last true Merovingian, a fleeting glimpse of what might have been. But perhaps his real epitaph lies in the abbey he loved. Saint Denis became the burial site for French kings for centuries, a monument to Dagobert's vision, proof that even as his dynasty crumbled, some part of its grandeur refused to die. The Carolingians didn't storm the throne in a single dramatic strike, they inched toward it, one calculated move at a time. It began with Pepin of Herstal, a mayor of the palace who, by the late 7th century, had become the de facto ruler of Austrasia. While the Merovingian kings busied themselves with ceremony, Pepin consolidated power, forging alliances with bishops and nobles who cared more about stability than royal bloodlines. His victory at the Battle of Tertry in 687 wasn't just a military triumph, it was a quiet revolution. For the first time, a mayor of the palace dictated terms to the entire Frankish kingdom, leaving the Merovingian king a mere spectator in his own realm. Then came Charles Martel, Pepin's illegitimate son, a man whose very nickname, the Hammer, hinted at his ruthlessness. Charles didn't just inherit his father's title, he perfected the art of ruling from the shadows. When the Merovingian throne sat vacant, he simply didn't bother appointing a new king for years, proving Francia could function perfectly well without one. But his defining moment arrived in 732, when a Umayyad army, fresh from conquering Spain, surged north into Frankish territory. The Battle of Tours wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a collision of worlds. Charles's victory didn't just halt the Muslim advance, it cemented his reputation as Europe's defender, a title no do-nothing king could claim. Here's the twist: Charles never took the crown, he didn't need to. By the time of his death in 741, the Carolingians controlled the military, the treasury, and the church's loyalty. The Merovingians still wore the crown, but everyone knew where true power lay. It was left to Charles's son, Pepin the Short, to finally cut the pretense. In 751, he sent the last Merovingian, Childeric III, to a monastery and had himself anointed king with the Pope's blessing. The message was clear: divine right now flowed from usefulness, not bloodline. And just like that, Europe's first dynasty slipped into history's shadows, outmaneuvered by the very men who'd once served them. Pope Stephen II didn't just anoint a king, he rewrote the rules of power. By the mid-8th century, the Merovingians were already ghosts in their own palaces, but the Carolingians faced a dilemma: how to remove a dynasty still wrapped in sacred mystique without sparking rebellion. The answer came from an unlikely ally, the Vatican. In 751, Pepin the Short sent messengers to Rome with a blunt question: who should rule Francia, the man with the title or the man with the strength? Pope Stephen's reply was a masterpiece of political theater. He declared it was unjust for one to be called king while another held real power, effectively greenlighting Pepin's coup. This wasn't just a favor, it was a transaction. The Carolingians and the papacy needed each other desperately. Lombard armies were threatening Rome, and the Byzantine Empire, the traditional protector of the church, was too weak to intervene. Stephen needed a military savior, Pepin needed divine legitimacy. Their pact reached its climax in 754, when the Pope crossed the Alps to personally anoint Pepin and his sons in a ceremony dripping with biblical symbolism. Holy oil, once reserved for Merovingian brows, now flowed for usurpers. In return, Pepin marched into Italy, crushing the Lombards and gifting conquered lands to the Pope. The famous donation of Pepin that laid the foundation for the Papal States. But let's peel back the layers of this betrayal. The church didn't just endorse the Carolingians, it erased the Merovingians. Chronicles were quietly edited, their miracles downplayed, their saints overshadowed. The message was clear: God's favor had shifted. What made this so audacious was how it flipped centuries of tradition. The Merovingians had always claimed authority from their sacred bloodline, their very bodies were relics. Now the church asserted it alone could anoint kings, turning divine right into a political tool. The fallout was immediate. Childeric III, the last Merovingian, wasn't killed. He was shaved bald, a deliberate desecration of his royal hair, and packed off to a monastery, his lineage snuffed out without a war. The Carolingians, once stewards, now sat on thrones they'd sanctified with papal blessing. And the Vatican, it gained more than land. It cemented itself as the gatekeeper of legitimacy, a role that would echo through Europe's history. This wasn't just the fall of a dynasty, it was the birth of a new world order where crowns could be borrowed and revoked by the will of Rome. Childeric III never stood a chance. By the time he was placed on the throne in 743, the Merovingian dynasty had been reduced to a hollow ritual kings who reigned but did not rule. Their long hair, the sacred marker of their bloodline, carefully maintained while real power flowed to the Carolingian mayors of the palace. Childeric wasn't even chosen for his leadership. He was selected precisely because he was pliable, a silent figurehead who could lend legitimacy to decisions made by others. For 8 years, he played his part flawlessly, attending ceremonies, signing documents prepared for him, and remaining conspicuously absent from the battlefields where Carolingian reputation was being forged. The end came with brutal efficiency. In 751, Pepin the Short decided the charade had gone on long enough, but overthrowing a sacred bloodline required more than force, it demanded theater. Childeric wasn't dragged through the streets or murdered in secret. Instead, he was subjected to a ritual humiliation designed to strip him of his divine aura. His hair, the very symbol of Merovingian power, was shorn in public, a calculated act that declared his family's connection to the gods severed. Then, with cold precision, he was bundled off to the monastery of St. Bertin, where he would spend the rest of his days in quiet obscurity. The message was clear. The Carolingians weren't just replacing a king, they were erasing an entire theology of rule. What makes Childeric's fate so haunting isn't just the violence of his deposition, but the meticulous way his legacy was dismantled. Chronicles from the Carolingian era dismiss him as a non-entity, a placeholder unworthy of detailed record. Even his burial site, if it exists at all, remains unknown, a stark contrast to the grand tombs of his ancestors. Yet in this deliberate erasure, we see the true power of myth. The Carolingians didn't just defeat the Merovingians, they rewrote history to make their rise seem inevitable, reducing 2 centuries of kings to footnotes in their own story. And yet, traces linger. In the quiet corners of medieval manuscripts, in the stubborn persistence of local cults venerating Merovingian saints, even in the later legends that would resurrect their bloodline as a source of mystery, a proof that no dynasty truly dies when its story is told in whispers. Childeric may have vanished into the cloisters, but the idea of the Merovingians, those half-legendary rulers born of sea monsters and sacred blood, would outlast the empire that sought to bury them. The moment the last Merovingian king was sheared of his sacred hair and cloistered away, the whispers began. History may have recorded the dynasty's end in 751, but legends refused to let them die. Some claimed Childeric III wasn't the final heir, that secret branches of the family had fled into exile, their bloodline hidden in monasteries, noble houses, or even peasant villages. Medieval chronicles speak of shadowy figures emerging decades later, men with the telltale long hair of Merovingian royalty, appearing at pivotal moments to stake their claim before vanishing again. One such pretender, a monk named Theuderic, allegedly rallied rebels in the Rhineland, declaring himself the true heir before being captured and executed. Whether imposters or genuine survivors, their very existence fed a potent myth that the sacred line of Clovis could never truly be extinguished. This wasn't just medieval gossip. The Merovingians had woven their mystique too deeply into Europe's psyche. Their rumored ties to divine bloodlines, Christ, the Quinator, ancient Trojans, made them more than kings. They became symbols of a lost golden age. Folk tales sprouted like wildflowers, tales of a sleeping Merovingian king beneath Mount Untersberg, waiting to awaken in France's darkest hour. The motif echoed Arthurian legends, blending history with prophecy, suggesting these rulers weren't merely deposed but transcended into myth. Even the church, complicit in their fall, couldn't stamp out their aura. Local cults venerated Merovingian saints like Dagobert II, their tombs said to heal the sick, as if their blood still carried supernatural power. Modern conspiracy theories seized these fragments and spun them into grand tapestries of hidden history. The idea of a surviving Merovingian bloodline exploded into pop culture with books like The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which posited that Christ's descendants, secretly safeguarded by the Priory of Sion, intermarried with the Merovingians. Never mind that the Priory was a 20th century hoax, the narrative stuck. It painted their overthrow as not just political but cosmological, a cover-up of humanity's holiest lineage. The Merovingians became pawns in a larger game, their story reshaped to fit everything from Templar treasure hunts to New Age prophecies. What makes these legends so enduring isn't their truth but their resonance. The Merovingians represent the ultimate what if. What if history's losers were actually its sacred guardians? What if the past we're taught is a carefully edited lie? Their afterlife in folklore and conspiracy speaks to a universal longing for lost golden ages, for hidden truths, for royalty that transcends crowns and becomes something far stranger. The Carolingians may have won the throne, but the Merovingians won the imagination, their ghosts lingering wherever people wonder what secrets the past still holds. The Merovingians didn't just adopt Christianity, they weaponized it. When Clovis knelt to be baptized in 496, he wasn't merely embracing a new faith. He was making a strategic alliance with the single most powerful institution left standing in the ruins of Rome. The Church, desperate for earthly protectors in an age of chaos, and the Merovingians, hungry for divine legitimacy, forged a partnership that would reshape Europe's spiritual landscape for centuries. This wasn't conversion, it was a merger. At the heart of this transformation stood Clotilda, the Burgundian princess who became Clovis's queen and the dynasty's patron saint of holy persuasion. Chroniclers painted her as a relentless evangelist, whispering scriptures into her pagan husband's ear until he finally converted after his victory at Tolbiac. Whether the story's true or not, Clotilda's legacy as the mother of Christian France cemented something revolutionary, the idea that royal women could be spiritual power brokers. She founded monasteries, intervened in theological disputes, and ensured her children were raised as fervent Christians, weaving piety into the very fabric of Merovingian rule. Monasteries became the dynasty's secret weapon. Kings like Dagobert I poured gold into abbeys like St. Denis, turning them into hybrid fortresses of faith and administration. These weren't just quiet retreats for prayer, they were economic hubs, scriptoria churning out legal documents alongside Bibles, and political safe houses where exiled nobles could be discreetly monitored. The Merovingians understood that controlling sacred spaces meant controlling narratives. When they gifted land to a monastery, they weren't just buying salvation. They were planting loyalists in strategic regions, ensuring the church's vast network of roads and messengers served royal interests. But their relationship with the clergy was far from serene. Bishops like Gregory of Tours, whose History of the Franks remains our primary source, walked a tightrope, praising devout Merovingian kings while discreetly documenting their atrocities. The dynasty's habit of appointing relatives as bishops blurred the line between altar and throne, creating ecclesiastical dynasties as fierce as any warlords. And then there were the saints. Merovingian rulers actively promoted cults around royal martyrs like Queen Radegund, who abandoned her throne to found a nunnery. These saints became living and dead propaganda, their miracles proof that God favored the ruling house. The irony, this spiritual empire building sowed the seeds of their downfall. By empowering the church, the Merovingians gave bishops the authority to later justify their removal. When Pepin the Short sought papal approval to seize the throne, he was exploiting a system the Merovingians themselves had built. Their greatest legacy wasn't just converting the Franks, it was proving that in medieval Europe the cross and the crown were never truly separate. And long after their fall, the monasteries they founded would keep their memory alive, copying chronicles that whispered of a time when kings walked hand in hand with saints. Gold gleamed in the flickering torchlight of Merovingian workshops, where artisans hammered history into rings, brooches, and belt buckles. This wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda in metal. The dynasty's jewelry fused Roman craftsmanship with Germanic symbolism, creating a visual language of power. Take the famous fibulae, those ornate cloak pins worn by elites. Some mimicked Roman eagle motifs, while others coiled into animal shapes straight from Frankish legends, serpents and birds intertwined, as if the wearer carried both empires on their shoulders. Archaeologists still marvel at the precision of their garnet inlaid designs, tiny stone fragments fitted like puzzle pieces, a technique borrowed from Constantinople but perfected in Frankish hands. But their boldest statement lay in stone, not gold. Hidden in the foundations of Europe's grand cathedrals are Merovingian fingerprints, the earliest experiments with what would become Gothic architecture. The Basilica of St. Denis, rebuilt under Dagobert I, introduced something revolutionary: rounded arches that dared to lift ceilings higher, letting light flood through windows in a way that foreshadowed the soaring verticality of later medieval churches. This wasn't accidental. Merovingian builders repurposed Roman columns but stacked them in new configurations, creating hybrid spaces where Latin chants echoed under roofs supported by Frankish engineering. Even their crypts whispered innovation, with labyrinthine burial chambers designed to showcase saintly relics as theatrical displays of sacred power. Then there were the manuscripts, those illuminated pages where Irish monks and Frankish scribes traded tricks. The Merovingians commissioned gospel books with borders that exploded in geometric patterns, Celtic knots colliding with Roman vine scrolls, all framing biblical scenes where Jesus sometimes bore the long hair of a Merovingian king. One surviving sacramentary from Luxeuil Abbey even sneaks a portrait of Queen Brunhilda into its margins, her crowned head peeking between psalms like a silent assertion of royal authority over the divine word. What made their art so distinctive was its refusal to choose between worlds. A Merovingian altar might boast Roman marble carved with Frankish runes, or a baptismal font decorated with pagan symbols baptized into Christian service. This wasn't confusion, it was cultural alchemy, a deliberate remixing of traditions to create something neither Roman nor Germanic, but uniquely Frankish. And though later Carolingian rulers would dismiss their predecessors' style as barbaric, the truth lingers in the stones. Every Gothic cathedral's ribs, every jeweled gospel cover, owes a debt to those kings who understood that art doesn't just reflect power, it consecrates it. Beneath the legends of sea monsters and sacred blood, the Merovingians were master architects of order in a chaotic age. Their greatest tool wasn't the sword, it was the law. The Lex Salica, or Salic law, wasn't just a legal code, it was a cultural bombshell, a written declaration that the Frankish kingdom would operate by rules, not just royal whims. Imagine a world where vengeance killings between clans threatened to tear society apart. The Merovingians offered an alternative, a precise price list for every offense. Kill a freeborn Frank, that had cost you 200 solidi, roughly the value of 100 cattle. Break someone's arm, 35 solidi. Even insulting someone's honor had its tariff. This wasn't just about justice, it was about replacing blood feuds with a system where stability had monetary value. But the real genius of Salic law lay in its subtle hierarchies. Fines varied based on the victim's status. Harming a royal official cost far more than harming a peasantry, enforcing the idea of a stratified society. Women couldn't inherit land, a clause that would echo through European royal succession crises for centuries. Yet the law also protected them. Assaulting a pregnant woman carried penalties double those for attacking a man. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were the scaffolding of a new social order, one where the king's authority seeped into every village dispute. Governance under the Merovingians was a patchwork of pragmatism. Unlike Roman emperors who ruled from marble palaces, these kings understood that power in post-Roman Europe had to be flexible. they appointed local strongmen as counts, granting them control over regions in exchange for military service and loyalty. These weren't bureaucratic offices but personal bonds. A count ruled because the king trusted him, not because he'd passed an exam. Over time, these positions became hereditary, laying the groundwork for the feudal system's web of obligations. The rise of aristocratic power wasn't an accident, it was baked into the system. As the kingdom expanded, kings relied on regional elites to manage distant territories, rewarding them with land that often stayed in families for generations. By the 7th century, these magnates, many mayors of the palace among them, controlled private armies and estates that rivaled the crown's. The Merovingians, distracted by court intrigues and succession battles, let power slip away one grant of land at a time. What's fascinating is how this decentralized model became its own undoing. The same system that allowed the Merovingians to govern a vast realm without modern infrastructure also created the warlords who would eventually overshadow them. Yet their legal legacy endured. Salic law's emphasis on written codes influenced everything from Charlemagne's reforms to Napoleon's civil code. Even in their decline, the Merovingians had etched their vision of order into Europe's DNA, proving that the most lasting empires aren't always built on battlefields but in the quiet pages of law books. By the 8th century, the Merovingian economy was unraveling like a frayed tapestry. Roman trade networks that once pulsed with goods from Syria to Britain had collapsed, leaving Francia isolated. Without the steady flow of Mediterranean grain, African pottery, and Eastern silks, local markets shrank to subsistence. Trading, a farmer might barter a chicken for a handful of nails, but gold coins grew rarer than summer snow. The dynasty's once proud mints, which had produced silver denarii bearing the profiles of kings like Dagobert, resorted to mixing copper into their alloys until the coins became so thin and debased they'd crumble in a merchant's palm. This wasn't just inflation, it was the slow suffocation of an economic system. Viking longships slicing upriver delivered the final blows. Starting in the late 8th century, Norse raiders exploited Francia's crumbling defenses, sacking monasteries like St. Denis, those very treasure houses the Merovingians had filled with gold to buy divine favor. The raids weren't just about plunder, they severed the fragile threads holding regional trade together. A merchant traveling from Paris to Cologne might once have relied on royal guards for safe passage. Now he'd risk encountering Norse axes or just as deadly bandits who'd emerged in the power vacuum. Roads once patrolled by Frankish soldiers became overgrown, their Roman paving stones looted for village huts. The Carolingians, watching from their mayoral offices, saw opportunity in the chaos. While Merovingian kings still presided over hollow ceremonies, it was the mayors who organized defenses, rebuilding bridges and fortifying river crossings. When Charles Martel crushed the Umayyads at Tours in 732, he funded his army not with crumbling royal coins, but with land seized from the church, a move that showed where real power now lay. The economic rot wasn't just weakening the dynasty, it was proving their irrelevance. A king who couldn't protect his people's granaries or guarantee the value of their coins was no king at all. Yet perhaps the cruelest twist lay in the legacy the Merovingians themselves had created. Their early patronage of monasteries, meant to secure spiritual power, had turned these abbeys into fat targets for Vikings. Their decentralized governance, once a strength, now meant no coordinated response to invasions. Even their famed Lex Salica, with its meticulous fines paid in gold, became absurd when gold itself vanished from circulation. The Dark Ages weren't just dimming the lights on Merovingian rule. They were revealing how thoroughly the world had changed beneath their feet, a world where survival belonged to those who could fight, feed, and finance, not just those with the longest hair and the oldest blood. While kings dominate the chronicles, the real puppet masters of Merovingian politics often wore crowns and veils. Take Fredegund, a former servant who clawed her way from concubine to queen, orchestrating assassinations with a poisoner's precision. Her feud with Brunhilda wasn't just personal. It was a decades-long chess match where pawns were princes and the board stretched across Francia. When her first husband, King Chilperic, hesitated to murder Brunhilda's sister, Fredegund handed him the dagger herself. Later, she allegedly poisoned her own stepson to secure her son's inheritance, proving maternal love could be as lethal as any blade. Yet for all her ruthlessness, Fredegund was also a builder. She funded monasteries, patronized poets, and in a stroke of political genius commissioned a lavish reliquary for Saint Maydard, ensuring the church's silence as she consolidated power. Her daughter Rigunth's dowry caravan, loaded with wagons of treasure, became the stuff of legend, a mobile propaganda display showcasing Neustria's wealth. This duality, holy benefactor and unholy schemer, was the Merovingian queen's signature. Then there's Balthild, the enslaved Anglo-Saxon who became queen regent. Captured in a raid and sold into the household of Clovis II's mayor, her intelligence caught the king's eye. Their marriage transformed her from property to power broker. After Clovis's death, she ruled in her sons' names, banning the sale of Christian slaves and founding abbeys like Chelles, which became nurseries for royal daughters and widows. But even piety had its limits when nobles bristled at her reforms. She retired to Chelles, carefully staging her exit to avoid Brunhilda's gruesome fate. These women exploited every crevice in the system. With no formal political office, they worked through marriage alliances, ecclesiastical appointments, and control of the royal treasury. A queen's chamber wasn't just a bedroom, it was a shadow chancery where bishops were bribed with relics and rival heirs, convinced to take monastic vows. Their religious patronage wasn't mere devotion. It built networks of loyal clerics who'd later anoint their sons or bury their scandals, the true measure of their influence. How desperately later chroniclers tried to erase it. Gregory of Tours paints Fredegund as a devil in silk, while Bede reduces Balthild to a meek saint. Yet the parchment cracks under their contradictions. How could these wicked or saintly women have shaped an empire unless they'd held real power? In the end, the Merovingian world was one where a queen might kiss a crucifix with one hand and slip poison into a cup with the other. Her legacy written equally in abbey charters and the bloodstains they dared not record. Childeric I didn't just die, he was buried like a king plucked straight from myth. When laborers accidentally uncovered his tomb in 1653 near Tournai, they found a hoard that stunned Europe. A sword encrusted with garnets, a cloak pinned with 300 golden bees, and a signet ring bearing his portrait in Roman military garb. But this wasn't mere treasure. It was a meticulously staged message to the gods. Every object whispered of a culture obsessed with liminal spaces, where death wasn't an end but a threshold, and power had to be proclaimed even in the underworld. The bees alone tell a story. These weren't just decorations, they were symbols dripping with meaning. Some scholars tie them to the Merovingians' mythical descent from the Quinator, their looping patterns echoing ancient Mediterranean motifs of rebirth. Others see them as badges of office, precursors to the fleur-de-lis that later French kings would adopt. But their placement on Childeric's cloak suggests something more ritualistic, as if each bee were a stinging reminder that his authority would follow him into the afterlife. Then there's the sword. Unlike later medieval blades designed for slashing, Childeric's was a spatha, a relic of Rome's cavalry tradition, its hilt inlaid with garnets arranged in geometric patterns that mirrored Frankish tribal tattoos. Buried unsheathed across his chest, it spoke of a warrior's readiness, a king expecting battle even in death, but the most telling detail, the absence of a cross. While later Merovingian graves would bristle with Christian symbols, Childeric's tomb held torques and amulets straight from pagan playbooks, proof that early Merovingians straddled two spiritual worlds. Women's graves reveal just as much. Queens like Arnegund, wife of Clothar I, were interred with ivory spindle walls and Byzantine silks, their bodies chemically preserved with rare spices from the East. One noblewoman's tomb near Cologne contained a crystal ball nestled in her skeletal hands, a nod to pre-Christian seer traditions that survived despite church disapproval. These weren't just personal effects, they were arguments in gold and bone, assertions that status and magic traveled with the dead. Childeric's tomb also held 21 sacrificed horses, their skeletons arranged in a precise circle. This wasn't grief, it was theater. Horse sacrifices were banned by Christian edicts, yet here they were, a defiant splash of pagan spectacle, the message. Some rules didn't apply to those who walked with gods. Later Merovingians would soften this duality, burying their dead with crosses pressed to their lips while still slipping coins into their mouths for Charon's ferry, just in case. What makes these graves so revolutionary is their hybridity. A Merovingian noble might wear a belt buckle engraved with Daniel in the lion's den while his pouch held rune-carved talismans. Their cemeteries became maps of cultural negotiation, Roman-style mausoleums housing Germanic weaponry, Christian epitaphs beside amulets of bare teeth. This wasn't confusion, it was confidence, a dynasty so secure in its power that it could pick and choose its afterlife accessories like a shopper in a spiritual marketplace. The real shock came when archaeologists compared royal tombs to common graves. While peasants rested with simple brooches or pottery, elites like Childeric took entire economies with them. His grave goods represented the lifetime earnings of hundreds of farmers. This inequality wasn't just display, it was cosmology. The Merovingians believed the afterlife mirrored Earth's hierarchies, and a king arriving in the next world without his gold might as well be a beggar. Modern looters and Napoleon's plunderers scattered much of Childeric's treasure, but what remains paints a portrait of a society obsessed with memory. Every clasp, every horse skull, every garnet was a vote against oblivion, a bet that glory could outlast flesh. When later chroniclers called the Merovingians lazy kings, they forgot one thing. These were people who built their eternities as carefully as their kingdoms, leaving behind crypts that still hum with their ambitions centuries after their voices fell silent. The myth of the Priory of Sion is a modern invention wrapped in medieval parchment, a tale so seductive it's eclipsed actual history. For centuries, the Merovingians were little more than footnotes in dusty chronicles. Then came the 20th century when a Frenchman named Pierre Plantard spun a web of forged documents, fake genealogies, and elaborate hoaxes to prove his own descent from these long-dead kings. His creation, the so-called Priory of Sion, claimed to be a centuries-old secret order tasked with protecting the true heirs of Christ and the Merovingian bloodline. Plantard's forgeries were exposed long ago, yet the legend took on a life of its own, supercharged by Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which treated fiction as fact and turned a conman's fantasy into global obsession. What makes this fabrication so sticky? Start with the documents themselves, elaborate forgeries stuffed with anachronisms. The infamous dossier Secrets, discovered in the Paris National Library in the 1960s, listed grand masters like Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton as priory members. Never mind that the paper bore 20th century watermarks or that Newton's name was misspelled. The sheer audacity of the lie gave it weight. Plantard understood something primal. People crave hidden histories, especially ones that seem to append everything they've been taught. By tying the Merovingians to Christ, he didn't just invent a secret society. He offered a counter-narrative to Christianity itself, a story where the church was the villain and a shadowy cabal the true guardians of sacred truth. But here's the twist: while the priory was fake, it tapped into real Merovingian mystique. These kings did cultivate an aura of divine legitimacy, their long hair, their rumored healing touch, their quinator origins. Plantard didn't create the mystery, he hijacked it. Even the name Sion was a brilliant trick, evoking both the biblical Zion and the French village of Rennes-le-Château, where a poor priest named Berenger Saunière supposedly found explosive parchments in the 1880s. Never mind that Saunier's real crime was selling masses for profit. The legend gave Plantard's hoax a ready-made setting steeped in conspiracy. The fallout reshaped how we see history. Suddenly, every medieval artifact became a potential cipher, every cathedral an allegory. The Da Vinci Code turned Plantard's fantasy into a billion-dollar industry, with tourists flocking to Rosslyn Chapel and Louvre galleries hunting for clues that weren't there. Scholars groaned, but the damage was done. The Merovingians were rebranded as Europe's lost messianic dynasty. Their overthrow not just a political coup but a cosmic crime. What's fascinating isn't the lie itself, but why we keep falling for it. The Priory myth thrives because it flatters our skepticism. It suggests history is a puzzle we can solve, if only we're clever enough to see through the Church's deceptions. The truth, the Merovingians were ambitious warlords, not divine royalty. Their fall wasn't a cover-up, it was the messy, unmagical result of bad governance and greed. But who wants to hear about tax policy when they could be chasing the Holy Grail? Plantard's greatest trick wasn't forging papers, it was understanding that the past is always a story, and the best stories are the ones we want to believe. The earth beneath Torn coughs up secrets when least expected. In 1653, workers digging near the Belgian town stumbled upon a burial so lavish it rewrote history. Childeric I's tomb, packed with golden bees, jeweled weapons, and sacrificed horses. This wasn't just a grave, it was a time capsule from the dawn of the Merovingian age, proof that these kings buried their dead like latter-day pharaohs. For centuries, scholars treated the Merovingians as semi-mythical figures, their stories blending with legend, but the dirt doesn't lie. Childeric's treasures confirmed what chronicles had only hinted. These rulers commanded staggering wealth and wielded symbols of power that echoed Rome while staying fiercely Frankish. Fast forward to the 21st century, and technology peels back even more layers. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of Tournai's necropolis revealed an entire royal burial landscape, hundreds of graves arranged in concentric circles, their alignments mirroring constellations. Some held warriors buried with axes angled toward the northeast, as if guarding against some spectral enemy. Others contained women clasping crystal amulets filled with herbs, their chemical residues still detectable after 15 centuries. One particularly controversial find was a child's skeleton wearing a toque normally reserved for kings, sparking debates about whether Merovingian succession rituals included sacrificial elements. Then there's the jewelry. Modern spectrography exposed trade networks no one knew existed. The garnets in Queen Arnigun's brooch traced to Sri Lankan mines via Byzantine middlemen. The cobalt glass in a nobleman's belt buckle, likely crafted in Persian workshops. These artifacts paint a picture of a connected world where Frankish elites flaunted global luxuries while their subjects bartered with clay pots. But not all discoveries sit comfortably with historians. In 2018, DNA analysis of skeletons near Cologne revealed something explosive, a cluster of graves with genetic markers linking them to Scandinavian populations, not local Franks. Were these Viking mercenaries buried with honors or evidence of a forgotten migration? The debate rages, with some scholars even suggesting these could be remnants of the elusive Heduli tribe, allies of early Merovingian warlords. Perhaps the most haunting finds come from the monasteries. Underneath the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, archaeologists uncovered mass graves. Dozens of young men with skull fractures consistent with battle axes, buried hastily beneath chapel floors. Carbon dating places their deaths squarely in the late Merovingian period, hinting at violent purges during the Carolingian takeover. These aren't just bones, they're silent witnesses to the brutal transition of power that history books often gloss over as a simple changing of the guard. Controversy still simmers over the so-called Merovingian Codex, a 9th-century manuscript discovered in a Swiss monastery vault. Its pages describe secret coronation rites involving lion's blood and solar alignment, rituals that clash with Christian narratives. Traditionalists dismiss it as medieval fantasy, but radiocarbon tests confirm the parchment dates to the Carolingian era. Was this a smear campaign against the old dynasty, or proof that the Merovingians clung to pagan traditions far longer than admitted? Every trowel of dirt reshapes the story. Recent digs in the Ardennes forest uncovered a ceremonial site with horse skulls arranged in spiral patterns around a central throne-like stone. Nearby, a hoard of gold coins bore the image of King Theudebert I, but with a twist. His portrait copied Roman emperor hairstyles, yet his name was stamped in runes. This duality, this deliberate cultural mashup, is the Merovingian legacy in microcosm. Rulers who borrowed freely from every tradition they encountered, crafting an identity as fluid as the borders they ruled. The most poignant discovery might be the simplest. In a nondescript field near Reims, a farmer's plough struck a small lead tablet last year. Inscribed in crude Latin were the words "Regnum nostrum non fractum," "Our kingdom is unbroken." Whether it was a defiant slogan or a desperate prayer, its timing is chilling. The tablet dates to the exact year Childeric III was deposed, as if someone knew an era was ending but refused to let the story die. And perhaps that's the lesson of Merovingian archaeology. No matter how deep we dig, some mysteries refuse to stay buried. The Merovingians have slithered from dusty chronicles into the neon glow of pop culture with a magnetism few historical dynasties can match. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code catapulted them into the mainstream, painting Childeric's descendants as the hidden heirs of Christ's bloodline, a conspiracy wrapped in Vatican intrigue and murder. Brown didn't invent the myth, but his cocktail of art, history, and thriller pacing turned the Priory of Sion hoax into a global obsession. Suddenly, tourists flocked to Rosslyn Chapel, not for its architecture, but to gawk at symbols that might hold clues to a Merovingian resurrection. The genius of Brown's portrayal lies in its emotional hook, the idea that history's losers were actually its sacred guardians, their truth suppressed by a villainous church. It's a narrative that transforms genealogical trivia into a cosmic whodunit, but the Merovingians' pop culture footprint runs deeper than bestsellers. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed franchise wove them into its labyrinthine lore, casting King Dagobert I as a pivotal figure in the ancient struggle between Templars and Assassins. The games reimagined Merovingian rulers not just as kings, but as players in a millennia-old shadow war, their long hair and mystic rituals repurposed as markers of esoteric knowledge. This taps into something primal about the dynasty. Their real-world aura of otherness makes them perfect for fictional universes where history's edges blur into fantasy. Even fantasy literature can't resist their pull. Catherine Kurtz's Durrani novels borrow Merovingian motifs for their royal mystics, while the Witcher series nods to their legacy with monarchs who wield both swords and ancient magic. What makes them so adaptable? It's the duality. They were historical enough to feel real, yet shrouded in enough legend to bend into any narrative. A Merovingian king in a video game isn't just a warrior, he's a cipher, his every decree hinting at lost gospels or eldritch pacts. Then there's cinema. The underrated The Last King plunges viewers into Norway's civil war, but its protagonist, a fugitive Merovingian descendant, carries the same weight of sacred blood. The film's climax hinges on whether his lineage grants him legitimacy or paints a target on his back. It's a theme that mirrors real medieval anxieties about bloodright versus merit, repackaged for modern audiences who crave underdog stories with a dusting of the divine. Why does this 1,000-year-old dynasty still captivate? Because they represent the ultimate what if. What if history's victors wrote the losers out of the story? What if the past is a puzzle missing its most important pieces? The Merovingians thrive in pop culture because they're more than kings. They're metaphors for every buried truth we ache to uncover. Whether as Templar pawns or Grail guardians, they let us play with fire, dancing along the line where fact becomes legend, and legend becomes something we desperately wish were real. The story of the Merovingians and the Holy Grail begins not in some dusty medieval manuscript, but in a sleepy French village that became ground zero for conspiracy theories. Rennes-le-Château, perched in the foothills of the Pyrenees, looks like the setting of a fairy tale: narrow stone streets, an ancient church, vineyards stretching to the horizon. But in 1885, its new priest, Bérenger Saunière, began acting strangely. Suddenly, this poor country cleric was spending like a king, renovating the church with occult symbols and building himself a lavish villa. Locals whispered he discovered something, perhaps parchments hidden in a hollow altar pillar, maybe even the treasure of the Knights Templar. Decades later, conspiracy theorists would link these rumors to the Merovingians, spinning a tale where Saunière had stumbled upon proof that the dynasty descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, their bloodline the true Holy Grail. Here's where fact and fantasy collide. The Templars, those warrior monks destroyed in the 14th century, did have ties to the Languedoc region where Rennes-le-Château sits. Some speculate they guarded Merovingian secrets after the dynasty's fall, perhaps even smuggling relics to the village. But the leap to Christ's bloodline stems largely from 20th century hoaxes, like the infamous Priory of Sion papers planted in French libraries. These forgeries claimed the Priory, a fictional secret society, had protected the Grail, which wasn't a cup but the Merovingian lineage itself. Yet buried beneath the hype are tantalizing historical threads. The Merovingians did cultivate an air of sacred royalty. Their long hair, rumored healing powers, and mythical quinator ancestry made them seem more like priest-kings than warlords. Medieval Grail romances like Chrétien de Troyes' Percival often featured enigmatic fisher kings guarding holy relics, figures some scholars linked to Merovingian refugees hiding in the Pyrenees after their overthrow. Even the Grail's description as a stone in Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival echoes the lapis exilis, a mythical gem some tie to the Frankish King Dagobert II lost regalia. The irony, the Merovingians themselves likely never heard of the Grail as we know it. The legend crystallized centuries after their fall, blending Celtic myth with Christian symbolism. But their mystique made them perfect candidates for retroactive Grail guardians. Conspiracy theories thrive on elastic history, stretching facts until they fit a grander narrative. The Merovingians' abrupt disappearance, combined with their aura of divinity, created a vacuum where speculation rushed in. So where does this leave us? The Rennes-le-Château mystery is a cocktail of real anomalies and fabricated drama. Saunière probably embezzled church funds, not Templar gold. Yet the village allure lies in its unanswered questions: the strange church carvings, the priest's encrypted journals, the whispers of something hidden beneath its cobblestones. Whether the Merovingians were truly Grail custodians matters less than why we want them to be. Their story taps into a deeper hunger for lost histories, for sacred bloodlines, for the idea that the past still holds secrets potent enough to rewrite the present. And in that space between myth and monument, the dynasty's legend lives on, far stranger than any fiction. Charlemagne's shadow looms so large over medieval history that it nearly eclipses the Merovingians entirely. But look closer and you'll see their fingerprints on everything he built. By the time he was crowned emperor in 800, the Carolingians had spent decades erasing their predecessors from public memory. Yet their empire stood on foundations laid by the very dynasty they'd replaced. The contrast couldn't be starker. The Merovingians ruled through sacred mystique, their power woven into legends of sea monsters and divine blood, while Charlemagne's regime was a machine of bureaucracy, conquest, and forced conversion. But was this a clean break or a carefully disguised inheritance? Take governance. The Merovingians had pioneered the blend of Roman law and Frankish custom, a hybrid system Charlemagne expanded with ruthless efficiency. His famous capitularies, legal decrees issued across his empire, echoed the Merovingians' Lex Salica, but with a key difference. Where Merovingian counts ruled through personal loyalty, Charlemagne's officials were accountable to imperial inspectors. He didn't destroy the old system, he industrialized it, turning regional autonomy into centralized control. Even the much-lauded Carolingian Renaissance had roots in Merovingian soil. Monasteries like Luxeuil and Corbie, which became hubs of learning under Charlemagne, were founded by Merovingian kings and queens centuries earlier. Their scriptoria had kept classical texts alive long before Carolingian scholars dusted them off for revival. Then there's the military. Charlemagne's conquests dwarfed the Merovingians, but his tactics were refinements of theirs. The Merovingians had mastered the art of absorbing defeated foes into their armies, a strategy Charlemagne perfected, swelling his ranks with Saxon and Lombard warriors. Even his infamous massacre at Verdun, where 4,000 Saxons were executed for resisting baptism, had a grim precedent. Merovingian kings like Clothar I had used mass baptisms as political tools, blurring the line between conversion and coercion. But the real irony lies in their sacred legitimacy. Charlemagne's coronation by the Pope in 800 was touted as a rebirth of Christian empire, yet it mirrored the Merovingians' own playbook. They'd forged the church into a political ally first, their queens funding abbeys while kings manipulated bishop appointments. Charlemagne didn't invent the alliance between throne and altar. He inherited it, then rebranded it as his own innovation. Perhaps the most telling evidence of continuity lies in the margins. Beneath the grand narratives of Carolingian chronicles, Merovingian traditions stubbornly persisted. Local courts still cited Salic law well into Charlemagne's reign. Peasants in the Ardennes left offerings at springs sacred to Merovingian saints, despite imperial decrees against pagan practices. Even Charlemagne's own court harbored whispers. His biographer Einhard recorded that the emperor kept a copy of the Merovingian genealogies, studying them with what one historian calls the fascination of a usurper. The truth, Charlemagne didn't erase the Merovingians, he metabolized them. Their decentralized governance became his missi dominii, their warrior nobility transformed into his sworn vassals. Their fusion of Germanic and Roman culture provided the blueprint for his empire. The Carolingians didn't rise from nothing. They climbed a ladder the Merovingians had built, then kicked it away so no one would see how they'd reached the top. In the end, the greatest testament to the Merovingians' legacy isn't what Charlemagne destroyed, it's what he stole. The Merovingian downfall wasn't a single misstep, it was a slow unraveling, thread by thread, until the entire tapestry of their rule disintegrated. At first glance, their collapse seemed sudden. One day, they were Europe's longest reigning dynasty. The next, their last king was sheared of his sacred hair and packed off to a monastery. But peel back the layers and you'll find a decline centuries in the making, fueled by forces both within and beyond their control. Their story isn't just about kings losing power, it's about how empires rot from the inside long before their walls crumble. Start with the poison of infighting. The Merovingians didn't just battle external enemies, they waged war on themselves. Their tradition of dividing kingdoms among sons, a practice meant to appease regional nobles, turned succession into a blood sport. Brothers murdered brothers, uncles slaughtered nephews, and queens like Fredegund and Brunhilda turned court politics into generational vendettas. Each civil war drained the royal treasury, fractured military loyalty, and emboldened regional warlords to act like kings in their own domain. By the 7th century, the realm was a patchwork of fiefdoms where local strongmen owed more allegiance to rival Merovingian factions than to any central crown. The dynasty didn't just fight for power, it consumed itself in the process. Then came the Carolingians, those cunning mayors of the palace who turned stewardship into supremacy. At first, they were mere administrators, handling the drudgery of tax collection and troop levies while Merovingian kings basked in ceremonial glory. But competence breeds ambition. Charles Martel's victory at Tours in 732 didn't just repel the Umayyads, it proved Francia didn't need a sacred-blooded king to survive. His grandson Pepin took the final step, leveraging church support to justify a coup cloaked in piety. The Carolingians didn't overthrow the Merovingians in battle. They simply rendered them obsolete like relic keepers in a world that had stopped believing in relics. Economic decay sealed the dynasty's fate. The Merovingian Golden Age had been built on Roman trade routes and plundered Gothic gold, but by the 8th century, those lifelines were severed. Viking raids strangled coastal commerce, debased coinage sparked inflation, and the once lucrative slave trade dwindled as Christian ethics took hold. Kings who couldn't pay their warriors lost their loyalty, and the Carolingians, with their church-backed land grants, offered a more reliable paycheck. The Merovingians weren't just politically weak, they were financially bankrupt, their prestige eroded by empty coffers. Yet the most fatal shift was in the very fabric of power itself. Early Merovingian kings ruled through personal charisma and tribal oaths, but Europe was changing. The rise of feudalism meant lords cared less about ancient bloodlines and more about who could protect their fields. When Charles Martel carved up church lands to reward his knights, he wasn't just buying loyalty, he was inventing a new social contract, one where service trumped ancestry. The Merovingians, with their mystic hair and sea monster pedigrees, belonged to an older world, one where legitimacy flowed from myth, not military might. Was their fall inevitable? Perhaps not, but it was likelier than not. Had a king like Dagobert I emerged in the 8th century with his knack for centralization and showmanship, might things have been different? Or were the Carolingians simply better suited to the harsh pragmatism of the emerging medieval age? The Merovingians' greatest weakness may have been their own success. They built a kingdom so vast, so culturally hybrid, that it demanded administrators more than figureheads. In the end, they didn't so much fall as fade, their legacy less a crash than a slow eclipse, obscured by the shadows of the very system they helped create. From mythical sea creatures whispered in Frankish legends to the shadowy halls of conspiracy theories, the Merovingians have never truly left us. Their story is one of paradox, a dynasty that rose from the ruins of Rome by blending brute force with sacred mystique, only to crumble when the world outgrew their brand of magic. They built a kingdom where queens schemed with poison and piety, where warriors swore oaths to long-haired kings said to heal with a touch, and where graves held treasures that still baffle archaeologists today. For 2 centuries, they weren't just rulers, they were living bridges between the pagan past and Christian future, their very existence a testament to the power of stories in shaping empires. What lingers isn't just their gold or their laws, but the questions they left unanswered. Were they descendants of a divine bloodline, as modern myths claim, or merely brilliant opportunists who knew how to spin legends into loyalty? Did their downfall come from weakness or from a world that no longer had room for kings who ruled by aura rather than administration? The Carolingians may have erased them from the throne, but they couldn't scrub them from the imagination. In whispers of the Priory of Sion, in the stubborn cults of Merovingian saints, even in the DNA of modern Europeans, their legacy pulses like a half-remembered dream. Perhaps that's their greatest trick, refusing to stay buried. Every few decades, someone dusts off their story and finds new secrets lurking in the margins. Historians debate their tax policies while treasure hunters chase their lost relics. Gamers battle as them in virtual worlds, and novelists weave them into apocalyptic prophecies. The Merovingians have become more than a medieval dynasty. They're a mirror reflecting whatever we need them to be: lost kings, holy grail keepers, or cautionary tales about the fragility of power. So what do you think? Were they Europe's last pagan kings or its first Christian monarchs, pawns of the church or victims of its ambition? Dive into the comments and share your wildest theories, because if there's one thing the Merovingians teach us, it's that history is never just about facts. It's about the stories we keep resurrecting, the mysteries we refuse to solve, and the whispers that outlast even the mightiest throne. And who knows? Maybe somewhere beneath the soil of France, a golden bee still waits to be found, ready to sting us awake to truths we've forgotten.